For centuries, the name human was a cautionary tale whispered across the spiraling arms of the galaxy, not because they were exceptionally strong or inherently evil, but because they were too much, too capable, too inventive, and far too prone to reckless decisions that could shatter decades of delicate galactic peace in a single, passionate outburst. It was simpler, most civilizations found, to give a human the right of way than to risk confronting them. Myriel had grown up knowing this fear, wearing it like a slightly uncomfortable, necessary suit of armor. In the cold, lawless void of the outer edges, where the fear of distant authority was a joke, survival was the only currency. She had long ago stopped paying the galactic reputation any mind. One rotation, while running a low-yield cargo between two forgotten asteroid mining colonies, her ship's ancient sensors picked up a thread of signal, faint, degraded, and almost certainly a trap. Most pilots would have scrubbed the coordinates and burned for cleaner space. Too weak a signal meant either a ghost or a hunter's lure. But there was a quality to this static, a frantic, high-pitched desperation that felt profoundly, overwhelmingly alive. It sounded small. It sounded childlike. Myriel didn't hesitate. She rerouted her ship, the Kettle, toward the source. The station she found was a mangled ruin, a former waste stop now orbiting a dead gas giant. It had been professionally gutted, torn apart by repeated external impacts and specialized breach charges. Corridors were scorched black, emergency lights flickered uselessly, and the air hissed perpetually into the cold vacuum. She navigated the wreckage until she reached the core residential sector. In one heavily reinforced compartment, a former nursery, she found them. 14 young Aran. The Aran were a species famed throughout the known sectors for their collective child-rearing, their profound cultural emphasis on empathy, and their absolute, strictly held pacifism. They had no tradition of warfare, not even in myth. These 14 were the sole survivors of a raider attack, left hidden behind a hastily sealed bulkhead. The eldest among them, a thin adolescent named Kivon, stood rigid in front of the others. He clutched a bent, heavy metal rod, his only weapon. Mistrust was a heavy, suffocating weight in his large, obsidian eyes. Raiders had often offered false help before striking. He saw a human, the legend of unpredictable violence incarnate, and he was terrified. Myriel ignored the weapon and the fear. She moved with quiet, practiced urgency. She didn't explain or attempt to reassure. She simply began gathering them, wrapping small, shaking bodies in thick thermal blankets from the Kettle's emergency stores, her movements efficient and absolute. She brought them aboard her ship, a cramped vessel that suddenly felt vast and crowded. For 3 days, Myriel guided them through the low-traffic channels, keeping the ship quiet, engines muted, and transponder silent. Yet the Syndicate found her. They had clearly tracked the signal of their own target. 4 Syndicate warships, sleek black knives, appeared on the long-range scanners. They moved to intercept without warning, their weapons systems already hot. The ensuing engagement was brutal and brief. Myriel, relying on ancient, half-forgotten human naval tactics that prioritized chaos and aggression over logical defense, managed to make the Kettle look like a much larger threat. She repelled the first 2 boarding attempts. She fought in a depressurized suit in the zero-G engineering bay, her hand burned raw on a compromised reactor coil, the ship groaning and half-dead around her. The third wave, however, was overwhelming, armored brutes tearing through the middeck like a storm. Myriel retreated. She slammed the final blast door leading to the compartment where the 14 Aran hid, their eyes wide with reflected light and terror. Myriel stood alone in the narrow corridor between them and the advancing Syndicate troops, her pulse rifle spent, her breath ragged. The raider commander, a hulking, scarred krill, stepped through the smoke, followed by 4 heavily armed mercenaries. He aimed a massive magnetic spear at her chest. "Step aside, human," the krill commander rasped, his voice amplified by his helmet. "These children are our property." Myriel felt the slick warmth of her own blood on her temple. She wiped it away, smearing a red line across her teeth, and smiled. It was a smile of pure, weary finality. "Apparently," she said, her voice dry and steady despite the roar of the depressurizing hull, "you've never met humans." She didn't wait for his reply. With her free, burning hand, she reached into the hidden access panel beneath her armor and triggered the ship's emergency protocol, an ancient human technology, rumored in legend, reserved only for the most desperate, impossible situations. It was a sequence that transformed the entire vessel, not just the reactor, into a massive, directed antimatter bomb. The alarm shrieked, a sound of absolute mechanical panic. Muriel grabbed the first small Aaron and hurled him into the attached emergency escape pod, then the next and the next. She pushed them all 14, into the tiny vessel. Kivon, the eldest, was last. He scrabbled at her suit, his young face contorted in desperate pleading. "Come, please, you must come." Muriel only shook her head, her helmet lights reflecting the approaching enemy soldiers. She slapped the emergency release and watched the final barrier seal. The pod was violently ejected just as the Krill commander shouted a confused, panicked order. It drifted instantly into the deep purple embrace of the adjacent nebula. Seconds later, the kettle erupted. It was a brilliant, consuming explosion of white-hot fury, a sudden star of protective wrath visible across 3 star systems. The Syndicate warships, caught at Ground Zero, were vaporized instantly. The 14 Aaron survivors grew up. They carried the memory of the human fire in their collective soul, a memory that would not let them return to pure, defenseless pacifism. Their people had never known the word army, but these 14 became the first warrior guard of the Aaron. They painted their ceremonial, segmented armor bright crimson, the color of the fire Muriel had left on her teeth in her final smile. Each wore a heavy metal symbol on their chest, the permanent, unerasable imprint of a human hand against a closing bulkhead. When decades later, the Unified Galactic Council finally asked General Kivon why a strictly pacifist people had created a military, the general, now an ancient, steadfast warrior, simply looked at the council's fear-filled faces. "She became our shield," General Kivon said, his voice level and unshakable. "We swore that no one would ever cross that line again." The galaxy had long feared humans for their inherent rage and their terrifying unpredictability. But Muriel's children proved something far more profound, that sometimes a single human can be a fire that blocks the path of darkness. Sometimes one person is enough to change the fate of an entire people.